But first, Martin, this week, over to Syria. We have to start here because it's been a horrendous week with the breaking of the ceasefire.
Well, the ceasefire was difficult to enforce anyway, but of course but
we had an attack on Syrian troops, killing about 60 or 80 of them last weekend, followed by this attack on the aid convoy.
Including by an RAF drone, of course. So, in other words, all those Labour MPs who voted for the RAF to be bombing ISIS inside Syria, not Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, obviously, the people like Hilary Benn and the Tory party, that ends up with 60 to 80 dead Syrian soldiers. And then the US comes out, the Russians call a UN Security Council meeting. The Americans are really angry that Samantha Power turns up to the meeting but doesn't go into the meeting. She just goes outside the meeting to talk to journalists and says, well, it was just an accident. What are they on about? And of course, both the Russians and the Syrians think it's not an accident. This is a deliberate thing that you've done here. ISIS attacked the Syrian army unit that you bombed, and they were bombing them for over 20 minutes, and then ISIS immediately attacked as soon as they bombed, including the RAF. Had finished killing those people.
Well, look, let me just correct you, because you did say that the Tory party voted for the air war in Syria, and actually there were some Tory MPs...
Some Tory MPs, to their credit, voted against. But those who voted for have all voted for us. Basically, if the Syrians were to interpret this as an act of war, then we're at war with Syria. And it could be, for example, that the RAF Waddington, where they fly those drones, some Syrian commander might say, right, what we need to do about that is we need to get to RAF Waddington and kill some RAF personnel. Maybe 60. 60 of yours, 60 of ours.
Well, surely ISIS might say the same. What's the difference between
Assad and ISIS, according to what the Syrians are saying, what the Iranians are saying, what the Russian General Staff are saying, they're saying that you support ISIS. There was a similar attack by an American airstrike on Iraqi army forces that were actually closing in on Mosul. They killed over 100 of them. And, of course, the Iraqi government, which is generally Shia-led, are also of the opinion that Britain and America are, in fact, supporting ISIS. And, in fact, we know, don't we, that Turkey supports ISIS, Qatar supports ISIS, Saudi Arabia supports ISIS. They're our allies. And the Russians' general staff and the Syrian general staff and the Iranian general staff have made their they've pretty much made their minds up about this. And I think they're right. We are supporting ISIS. And this is the reality. And we pretend that we're bombing Syria to get ISIS, and in actual fact, we're using ISIS to try and overthrow Assad and use them as a kind of a fox that allows us to chase in there and do what we want.
The British and the Americans and the Danes have admitted to being part of this attack on the Syrian army, the Syrian Arab Army.
Can I just mention about the Syrian Arab Army? They've taken 60,000 casualties in the last 4 years. 60,000 casualties fighting Islamic extremists, including ISIS. When is the British Army going to take 60,000 casualties and carry on fighting?
Of course, the possibility is that those people involved in these RAF drone strikes might actually have been Americans, because we're not quite sure what happens inside these so-called US bases. This RAF... Just a minute, Martin. Just a minute. The RAF Waddington, there's loads of USAF personnel at RAF Waddington.
Indeed. So somebody sitting in RAF Waddington with the imprimatur of the British government on it, whether it's an American citizen or a British citizen, was involved in the killing of 60 Syrian army soldiers. And that's 60,000 plus 60 that casualties that they've taken.
We do know who conducted that attack, but there's a bit of a mystery around the attack on the aid convoy a couple of days later. I think it was Monday.
Yeah, well, I've been looking at this, and the Russians have said, look, we didn't have any aircraft in the area. You did have a drone in the area. We had a drone in the area. And they showed photographs of the trucks with a rebel mortar being towed along by the trucks, and if you actually look at the pictures...
Hang on, an aid convoy with a mortar in tow?
Well, indeed. That's why the Russians saying, look, there's a mortar in the middle of the aid convoy. It's just, it's a rebel aid
In which case, maybe it was the Russians then, because they said, well, you can't have this because it's not an aid convoy, it's got a mortar involved.
What the Russians are saying is they want a full investigation, but they're pointing out, if you look at the photographs, there's evidence that the trucks caught fire. There's definite evidence of that. There's no evidence that they were hit by bombs. There's no craters. There's nothing like that. There's just evidence of fire. And, of course, given the way that the rebels work with their handlers in MI6, CIA, etc., they're quite capable of attacking the convoy and then saying the Russians did it. They're quite capable of doing that. The rebels could probably think up doing something like that on their own, and the white helmets just happen to be there to film it all. Those famous white helmets, which are funded by your taxes, folks, but they're actually embedded with the al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda Syria. And, of course, they are working with British Special Forces, etc.
So, anyway, the long and short of it is complete breakdown in the ceasefire, although, of course, it has allowed a little bit of aid into Aleppo to help any civilians who are left there. Also, though,
Don't
Martin...
forget, can I just mention that Aleppo, it's only the eastern part of Aleppo. The majority of the population in Aleppo is under government control. And they're basically, the rebels are using the people in the bit they control as human shields. That's what's going on. And they said, we're not, we don't want a ceasefire anyway.
I mean, in order to get a bit of balance of this, I went to have a look at the FARS news agency. That's FARS news agency, based in Iran. And what they're saying is 30 Israeli foreign intelligence officers were killed in Russia's calibre missile attack in Aleppo. So this is part of the attack on the rebel-held areas of Aleppo. And yet apparently there was a bunker with 30 Israeli and other national foreign intelligence officers in there.
Well, that's what the Iranians are saying. Whether it's true, you can make up your own. What people need to realise is we need to hear what everybody's saying. The Iranians are saying that Israeli military personnel were killed inside Aleppo. Now, I can believe that. It's perfectly feasible.
Okay,
we know that the Israelis,
rather than just the headlines, let's have a look at go into a bit of detail here. Russian warships stationed in Syria's coastal waters, says FARS News, targeted and destroyed a foreign military operations room, killing over 24 Israeli and Western intelligence officers. The Russian warships fired 3 calibre missiles at the Foreign Officers Coordination Operation Room in Deir Ezzar region in the western part of Aleppo near Saman Mountain, killing 30 Israeli and Western officers. The Arabic language service of Russia's Sputnik news agency quoted battlefield source in Aleppo on Wednesday this week. The operations room was located in the western part of Aleppo province in the middle of sky-high Saman Mountains and in old caves. The region is deep into a chain of mountains. Several US, Turkish, Saudi, Qatari and British officers were also killed along with the Israeli officers.
Well, I hear what they say. I don't necessarily believe anything I hear, but it's quite likely that, for example, British military personnel have been killed inside Syria, but we haven't heard about it because they're not supposed to be there, basically. They've got no legal basis to be there. If there are British military personnel in Syria and they get killed by the Syrian army, well, I'm afraid that's not murder. That's just, you shouldn't be there. And if you get killed, that's just too bad, isn't it?
Some of the other latest headlines from Syria, they have announced an offensive now as the truce talks fail. That's the Assad government based, of course, in Damascus, and also Turkey won't join Raqqa invasion if the Kurds are involved. So the Kurds and the Turks are falling out as to whether they're really going to take on the rebels and ISIS. Also, Russia has rejected John Kerry, the US Secretary of State's demand to ground all planes in Syria. Now, I think what they're saying is, look, whilst this aid is being moved around, let's just say we don't want any aircraft at all in Syria. That's what John Kerry is proposing.
The ceasefire has broken down because the rebels won't accept it. And they haven't. And eventually, after several days of the Syrian army trying to have a ceasefire with them, they just weren't prepared to have a ceasefire. Then the NATO air forces come over the border and kill 60 Syrian soldiers. And at that point, they say, "Well, there is no ceasefire." I think the purpose of having a ceasefire from the Syrian government and Russian position is to demonstrate we are prepared to have a ceasefire. It's them that's not prepared to have a ceasefire. And if I was in charge in Damascus, I would say, right, let's get this absolutely clear. You are not to fly your planes into Syrian airspace, whether you're Turkish, whoever you are, Danish, American, whoever you are. We've got SS-300 air defence systems here from the Russians. Let's just shoot you down. So if people want a war with Syria, they can have a war with Syria, and that means dead RAF pilots.
Another part of this, Martin, of course, is we heard back in last month that the Chinese are stepping up their military cooperation with Assad. One of their top admirals visited Damascus, and the media reported back in August, a signal of growing concern in Beijing about the course of the civil war. Rear Admiral Guan Yufei, he heads China's Office for International Military Cooperation, met Lieutenant General Fahad Jassim, who's the Syrian Defence Minister, and they are willing to, they say, to strengthen cooperation and bring their advisors in. Now, effectively, what's happening is Syria is turning into a kind of microcosm of this great superpower war that's going on in the outside world. There's economic warfare, there's trade barriers being put up, for example, with the Russians, etc. But it's all seems to be focused on the ground in Syria.
It is, and, you know, at any moment you could have a situation where a British plane is shot down by the Russians, or vice versa, and World War III could kick off. And people have got to realise if that's where we're going, that's where we go. If they really want to keep intervening in Syria, you will eventually cross a tripwire, and we will be at war with Russia. And that means, for example, that if RAF planes flying over Syria will be shot down.
Well, it's only a drone, so it won't actually kill anybody, won't it?
Obviously, if you're dealing with drones, then you have to find out where the drones are being flown from and kill the people there, don't you? If there's a war on, then that's it, then it's a war. Come on, let's not pussyfoot around here. If people want a war, let's have one. But of course, hopefully, if we do get to that point, the Syrians and the Russians will thrash the people that are trying to overthrow the government.
So are there people within our government, the Ministry of Defence and our military that want a war, do you think?
Well, I think what's going on is that the Pentagon are not happy with this whole ceasefire discussion thing that Kerry and Obama are pushing, which is why they probably killed the Syrian soldiers to kill off the ceasefire. And General Dunford, who's the US commander, said, well, people shouldn't presume that was an accident when we killed those soldiers, you know. And you know what? It probably wasn't an accident. Somebody wants a war. But of course, people got to be careful who wish for a war. They may get what they wish for. And you know what? It will be very interesting to see when the Battle of Syria is fought, like the Battle of Britain. With Russian air defences trying to take on NATO. In the past, NATO just presumed that they would have air superiority. I think it's going to be very interesting. If it comes to a proper air battle, it may very well be that NATO will lose air superiority over the whole Middle East if they really want. If they really
but
want
NATO
to go to war
still
with
got their satellites, Martin, even higher up.
Well, it doesn't matter. They can be shot down as well, can't they?
One of the interesting aspects of this is one could consider it as a way that the Russians and NATO are almost looking at what the other side is capable of in Syria with a view to a wider war.
Indeed, and what the Russians have been doing is quietly showing the NATO forces that they haven't got superiority. The capabilities of the Russian in electronic warfare, etc., are actually very, very, very high. And if it comes to a straight fight between NATO air forces and the Russian air force, I wouldn't bet on the NATO air forces winning.
Also, I was looking at this earlier on in the week. We discussed it, I think, maybe once or twice on here before. But ISIS have come up with some amazing reasons as to why they don't attack Israel, even though, of course, they're quite capable of doing that, being in Syria right next door to Israel. Excuse me. Martin, why do you think, and what are the official statements from ISIS saying about why Israel is not one of their targets? I mean, ideologically, if you look at all their propaganda, the Israelis, the Zionist state, is the enemy, and yet they're not interested in fighting with them, it seems. It's anybody else almost.
Well, that's because ISIS, al-Nusra Front, and all the other groups are basically being run by Western intelligence services.
But okay, we've heard that before from you again and again. But what reason do ISIS come up with as to why they're not?
Well, the reason ISIS, the ostensible reason is that they think that they've got to get rid of all of the unbelieving Muslims first. So the Shia, the Christians, they've got to clean out the Muslim house before they go on to take on the Zionist state.
So does that mean going through places like Iran and getting rid of anybody that doesn't agree with ISIS in Iran?
Yes. Ultimately, the ideology of ISIS as it's been presented is that they want to kill all unbelievers.
Just a minute. So ISIS is actually more targeting Islamic countries than it is say Israel, which they're supposed to be against.
Well, that's because it is effectively a tool of intelligence services, like the Saudis and the Saudis and the Israelis are very, very close.
But hang on, ISIS issues its own statements, for example.
Yes, I know, but I mean,
and they issue
they're not to be taken at face value.
They issue their own videos, for example. How can you say that this is being done by the West?
Well, in actual fact, it'd be very interesting to know where the funding comes from to create these videos and so on. The Russians have...
It comes from oil. They're selling oil.
Yeah, they're selling oil, but you know how they sell the oil? They drive it in trucks into Turkey, and then the Turkish government sells the oil onto the Israelis on the black market, and that creates cash which allows ISIS to function, because the Turkish government allows it to function. And when the Russians started bombing the convoys that took the oil out of Syria, the Turks went mad, because it was, what are you doing? You're bombing, the evidence that shows that the Western intelligence services and the Western powers are behind ISIS after 4 years of war is pretty much overwhelming. I know most people think, we're fighting ISIS, aren't we? We're against ISIS. No, we're not. We're not against ISIS. It's all a game. So ISIS is being allowed to operate. There's a senior Israeli military figure the other week was just saying, well, we shouldn't get rid of ISIS. They're really useful. And, he's been coming straight out and saying it. And, of course, you can be quite sure that the Russian general staff, the Iranian general staff and the Syrian general staff know exactly what they're up against.
But
they're fighting ISIS backed by Western military forces.
What did the British general staff know about this?
Well, the British general staff are split down the middle, as far as I can see. There's some people who talk a bit of common sense, and then there's other people just talking rubbish.
And what about in the United States? Because we've had General Michael Flynn. He was the head of the not of the NSA, what was it? The Defence Intelligence, the DIA, Defence Intelligence Agency. He was saying that it was a willful creation of the US military, and the US politicians.
Yeah, well, both he and General Dempsey were resigned, pushed out of the US military, because they said, well, we don't really agree with. I mean, Dempsey saying, well, actually, what I was doing when I was head of the army is I was basically helping out the Syrian regime with intelligence and so on, because I don't agree with the White House's policy of supporting ISIS. But I mean, it's out there in the open. We've got 2 US generals telling us, yes, we do support ISIS, and we do support ISIS. Then we say, oh, we've got to stop ISIS. No, that's why we're killing the Syrian army, because we want to stop ISIS.
We haven't heard that much about that story on the BBC. Another one we haven't heard much about is the 9/11, what really happened on the September the 11th attacks, because Egyptian state media this week has claimed that ISIS is made up. 9/11 was carried out by the West to justify the war on terror. ISIS could have been invented by the US to justify the devastation, partitioning and occupation of the Middle East. So a columnist for a state-run newspaper in Egypt, that is, saying that, is it possible to believe the official version from the US government of the events of September the 11th, 2001, wrote journalist Noha al-Shanobi in Al-Ahram, a major national Egyptian newspaper owned by the government. She said that the World Trade Center and the Pentagon attacks could have been premeditated to justify the war on terror. And a column published at the end of August, this has really only recently been translated into English. She also cast doubts over the veracity of the actions of the so-called Islamic State, alleging the extremist group could have been made up to trick the world and validate US foreign policy. She doesn't appear to shy away from controversial subjects. Her weekly column recently discussed issues such as burkini bans, French military involvement in Libya, and whether it's acceptable to sacrifice chickens, ducks and geese.
Well, I mean, the dogs in the street in the Middle East know that the Western intelligence services are terrorists. It's as simple as that. It couldn't be plainer. It's as simple as that. The so-called Islamic extremists are largely funded, armed and trained by the Western powers and their Gulf state allies. Everybody knows that, and ultimately it's going to lead to world war.
Oh, thank you, Martin. That's a cheerful thing.
Well, I'm afraid it is, isn't it? You can't really. I mean, we're right on the cusp of it.
I don't necessarily agree with you. A bit like your stuff that you say with the crash that's absolutely inevitable. All the time that there is even small advances being made in this kind of low intensity war, then surely the powers that be are going to be happy with that.
Well, yes, what they want is, like in 1984, is continuous war, so that they can carry on spending money on weaponry. That's what the game really is. And
meanwhile, of course, our civil liberties are being taken away, and we mentioned drones earlier.
Well, our civil liberties are also being taken away by the terrorists who blew up the World Trade Center, and they weren't actually they weren't working. They weren't ISIS. ISIS
weren't around.
No, they didn't
anyway,
exist
look.
then.
Drones will stay in the air for weeks and track whole populations, says Edward Snowden. Solar-powered drones will stay in the air for weeks, tracking the movements not just of individuals but of whole populations, the NSA whistleblower wrote in an article published back in May this year. Making drones more persistent is a capability which the US has been pursuing forever, Snowden wrote in The Intercept, which of course is a great place. I think you should have it bookmarked on your computer. Have a look at that website from Brazil. loads of brilliant stuff coming out there. Of course, it's one of the main places which is leaking the Snowden material. The goal is to deploy solar-powered drones that can loiter in the air for weeks without coming down. Once you can do that, you can put any typical signals collection device on the bottom of it to monitor unblinkingly the emanations of, for example, a different network of addresses of every laptop, smartphone and iPod. You know not just where a particular device is, in what city, but you know what apartment each device lives in, where it goes at any particular time and by what route, he explained. When such surveillance extends to at least several cities, the security agencies harness the ability to track the movements not just of individuals but of whole populations. Now, Martin, this does remind me, this obsession with collecting a kind of mass database and profiling of the entire population of planet Earth, exactly what the Nazis were doing in the 1930s.
Yeah, with much less advanced technology. But of course, this technology is double-edged. As you were speaking there, I was just remembering what happened with the Hariri assassination in Lebanon, where Hezbollah hacked into Israeli drones. They were saying that Hariri wasn't killed by a car bomb by us, or a suicide bomb by us. He was killed by an Israeli drone. And then they gave a press conference where they showed the video footage from the Israeli drone because they'd hacked into it. So if you've got a drone that's flying over Syria, say, and getting loads of information, you know, a NATO drone, it's quite feasible for the Syrian or the Russians to just hack into that drone and take control of it.
Well, this is a kind of dystopic future that they're painting, isn't it? And you're painting here because I know you're absolutely right. Back in 2004, I think it was, when the Shia insurgency started in Iraq, that was caused because of a shutdown of a newspaper, the al-Sadr newspaper, when Paul Bremer just decided to send the boys round and the Humvees and close this place down and padlock it up, which had been the main organ for the Shia population in Iraq. Just closing down a newspaper, just like that. This is what these guys do. And the reason they'd done that is because the previous edition had on its front page a whole load of witness testimony that so-called suicide bombing hadn't been anything of the sort. It had been a drone attack. And these missiles come in so fast from these drones, you don't get any kind of warning. You just hear an explosion and nobody really knows where that explosion has come from.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is all ongoing, isn't it? But as I say, it's double-edged. It could very well be, if we get into an air war over Syria, that we will find out what Russian capabilities really are, because I think they're quite capable of taking over NATO drones. So NATO's got all this fancy kit. I mean, the Snowden case itself is also fascinating. Some low-level guy in the bureaucracy, some subcontractor, goes into work with an MP3, and he's got all of the information that the NSA's been collecting on everybody, just like that. Just think how leaky these systems actually are.
It's like an iPod or something, just a little memory stick.
That's right. I mean, all these clever electronic systems that NATO very much depends on. What the Russians have been developing is electronic countermeasures. We just knock out all the electronics.
I was fuming the week before last because of this leak to do with Menwith Hill, which wasn't reported by a single London newspaper. Very important information about the targeting for these illegal drone killings around the world being done from Yorkshire, from Menwith Hill, and it's extremely frustrating that these leaks are not being reported. So I thought I'd go back and find a recent talk by Edward Snowden. He does these kind of live link-ups with all sorts of groups in the Western world. Maybe we should put a request in to get him on this show. But in this particular clip, he talks about the way that what he witnessed at the National Security Agency and as a private contractor at Booz Hamilton and various other organisations, including the CIA he worked for, because he'd come from a military family. He said that effectively this is a network to close down basic things like having freedom of association. So when a group gets together, maybe a little group like Acorn here in Bristol, to help defend evictions, there is a possibility now of closing that network down, putting them under surveillance, finding out who the key people are and destabilising them or removing them in one way or another. So anyway, let's have a listen now to Edward Snowden, one of his recent talks.
My grandfather was in the military, my father was in the military, my mother still works for the government, my sister works for the government, and I worked for the government. I was a staff officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. I had signed up to join the U.S. military in the wake of the September 11th attacks. I actually signed up for the invasion of Iraq because I believed that fundamentally our government had noble intents, and it did good things, and it did them for the right reasons. What I was not